Okay, let's unpack this. When you think of Vikings, what immediately springs to mind? For many of us, it's probably that iconic image, right? Long ships, dragon heads cutting through the mist, landing somewhere in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. England, France.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We picture those, brutal raids, Lindisfarne, the Seine, maybe settlements in Ireland. It's a powerful narrative.
It really is. Axe-wielding warriors, swift assaults, destruction from the north. That's the stereotype.
But that's not the whole story, is it?
Not even close. And what's truly fascinating here is that while, yes, that happened, the actual reach and complexity of Viking societies went so much further. We're talking about influence stretching into places, into cultures. Most people just don't connect with the word Viking at all.
Right.
And these connections created deep, intricate, often really surprising relationships.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. This hidden history, this multifaceted relationship between people from Viking societies and the various Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. And it's not just conflict. It's a story that actually opened up pathways, didn't it? Right into the heart of the East.
Absolutely. Connecting the Nordic world to these distant empires, vast trade networks, cultures thousands of miles away. It's huge.
So our mission, our deep dive today, is really to broaden your understanding of the Viking Age.
Fundamentally, we want to explore how these two distinct peoples, the Norse and the Slavs, how they actually interacted.
Through conflict, yes, but
also through incredibly lucrative trade, yeah.
And profound cultural exchange and even long-term settlement.
And we'll do this by looking at what? Historical accounts, archaeology?
All of it. We'll sift through the chronicles, the sagas, but also the really compelling archaeological finds, the stuff they left behind, and the economic evidence, like coins.
To show that these people weren't just localized raiders heading west.
Exactly. They were integral, dynamic participants in what was, frankly, a remarkably globalized medieval world.
A much richer picture. Oh, far richer, more nuanced, more astonishing, really, than the standard view. So, yeah, prepare to maybe redefine your idea of a Viking.
Okay, so before we get to the Vikings arriving in the East, we need to set the stage properly. Who are the Slavs?
Right.
I mean, before these river-faring vessels started showing up on their waterways, what was their world like?
That's the essential starting point, because the Slavs were definitely a people on the move themselves, part of a much bigger historical picture.
Yeah.
You look at the first half of the first millennium CE, say the 1st to the 6th centuries. It was a time of huge demographic shifts all across Europe.
Okay.
While folks in Scandinavia were sort of slowly developing into what we'd later call proto-Viking communities, during your Iron Age, things were really dynamic further east.
You had other groups moving around, too.
Oh, yeah. You had the Huns, the Goths, the Avars. These massive movements were creating a really fluid, sometimes volatile environment.
So a continent in flux. And the Slavs emerge out of this as a distinct people.
Precisely. By around the 6th century CE, we start to see this distinct group, bound by a common language, shared cultural traits. The people we now call Slavs begin expanding outwards.
From where, originally?
The general consensus points towards the forested, maybe swampy regions of modern-day Belarus and Ukraine, possibly parts of southern Poland, too.
And the name Slavs, what does that tell us?
It's fascinating, actually. It likely comes from the Proto-Slavic word slovo, people who speak the same language, or maybe just word or speech. It immediately tells you how important that shared language was for their identity.
So they define themselves by their speech, distinguishing them from others.
Exactly. From those who spoke different languages, the Nemtsi, they apparently called some foreigners, which kind of meant mutes, or those who babble. Language was key.
Okay, so a shared identity, a common tongue, and then this incredible expansion. What drove that? It couldn't have been easy moving across such huge areas.
No, definitely not easy. It was likely a mix of things, as these large movements usually are. Probably some internal pressures first.
Like population growth?
Yeah, population growth, pushing them to find new land to farm. Maybe environmental factors too, climate shifts, resources dwindling in their original homelands.
And just opportunity, seeing new lands.
Absolutely. Opportunity is always a huge driver. Fertile lands becoming available, maybe areas less populated after other groups moved on, the chance to build new communities. And these factors pushed Slavic tribes out across a massive area, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, down into the Balkans, modern Poland, Ukraine, all the way south and west.
Wow. And was this mostly peaceful settlement, or?
It It seems to have been a mix. A lot of settling into less populated areas, but definitely interactions, sometimes conflict with existing groups too.
And what about their society? Were they nomadic or settled farmers?
Overwhelmingly agrarian farmers. Their whole lives, their society's rhythm revolved around agriculture.
What were they growing?
Things like millet, wheat, barley, rye, using pretty simple tools for the time. Basic plows, sickles, hoes. Effective enough, though.
And how were they organized?
Around kinship, extended families, clans, that was the core, provided cohesion, support. They lived in villages, often fortified.
Fortified. So they needed defense.
Seems so. Palisades, earthworks around villages are pretty common finds. Suggests a settled life needing protection, not constant wandering. These villages were homes, but also economic hubs, craft centers.
And their beliefs. You mentioned polytheism earlier.
Yeah, polytheistic, like many early European peoples, deeply connected to nature, animism, ancestor worship. Their gods were tied to the land, fertility, the harvest.
Any specific gods we know of?
Perun is a big one, god of thunder, sky, war. You can see parallels with the Norse Thor there.
Interesting.
And Mokash, a really important goddess, fertility, the earth, weaving. Their rituals involved offerings, seasonal celebrations tied to farming cycles.
So a really established society, complex beliefs. And you mentioned they even influenced early states before the Vikings arrived.
They absolutely did, and that's crucial for understanding the landscape the Norse encountered. By the 7th century, Slavic culture was widespread, not just through settlement, but influence. Look at the first Bulgarian Empire in the Balkans. It was actually founded by Turkic Bulgars, steppe people.
Right, not Slavs initially.
Exactly. But these Turkic rulers were gradually assimilated by the much larger Slavic population already there. They adopted the Slavic language, customs, eventually even Eastern Orthodox Christianity.
And this happened before significant Viking contact in that area.
Yes, before. It just highlights how dynamic things already were. It wasn't a static world waiting for the Vikings. It was complex, peoples mixing, evolving constantly.
This really does set the stage, doesn't it?
Yep.
You've got these established agrarian societies, their own beliefs, budding political structures shaping Eastern Europe, and then people from Viking societies arrive. So what was that like? A collision? Or something more complex?
Oh, definitely more complex. A confluence, really. A mix of opportunity, exploitation, and eventually kind of co-creation.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because we usually think of the Viking Age, starting with that Lindisfarne raid, 793 CE, that big symbolic attack in England.
The classic starting point in the West, yeah. Sent shockwaves.
But for understanding the East, maybe the story starts earlier. And elsewhere.
That's a really important point. While Lindisfarne is iconic for the Western narrative, there's strong evidence sources like the Viking Herald really emphasize this, that the eastward push began maybe half a century sooner.
Like where?
Around 750 CE, give or take. There was a raid, seemingly similar in nature, unprovoked attack on Saaremaa, an island that's now part of Estonia.
Saaremaa, okay.
And this event, though less famous, arguably marks a pivotal new phase. Viking societies expanding eastward, across the Baltic, deeper into Eastern Europe.
So their focus wasn't just west from the get-go.
Not at all. Their gaze, their drive for, well, exploration and wealth seems to have been directed east just as much, maybe even more so initially when it came to setting up extensive trade.
So they start probing east. But how do they travel inland? These aren't coastal raids anymore. You can't sail a longship across modern Russia.
No, not across land, but they were absolute masters of the rivers. They quickly figured out how to navigate the huge, complex river systems crisscrossing Eastern Europe.
Like the Volga, the Dnieper.
Exactly. The Volga stretching thousands of kilometers down to the Caspian Sea. The Dnieper flowing south to the Black Sea. These weren't just rivers. They became medieval superhighways.
Trade routes.
Vital trade routes, arteries connecting the Baltic Sea in the north, all the way down to the Caspian and Black Seas, and from there, connecting to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates.
Incredible. So these rivers fueled a massive medieval economy. What was moving along them? What made it so worthwhile for the Norse?
Oh, the goods were incredibly valuable, hugely lucrative. You had stuff flowing north, luxury items.
Like what?
Fine silks from Byzantium, maybe even further east. Shimmering silver coins, dirhams from the Islamic world. Exotic spices, cinnamon, pepper, ginger coming up from distant lands into Scandinavia.
Wow. Wealth for the elite.
Definitely. And then flowing south, the Norse were trading things like furs.
Furs were big.
Huge, especially luxury furs, sable, squirrel, beaver, highly prized in warmer climates for status, warmth, also amber from the Baltic region,
Right.
and a really significant and tragic commodity enslaved people.
Oh, that was a major part of it.
A huge part, especially early on. People captured in raids on Slavic villages or maybe acquired from other tribes, sent south.
Where do they end up?
Some back in Scandinavia, but many went to major slave markets across the medieval world. Big cities like Baghdad, Constantinople, even Cordoba in Spain or Dublin. It was a truly interconnected, if brutal, economic web.
That paints a really vivid and pretty grim picture of the economics, not just local plunder, but tapping into international markets on a huge scale.
Absolutely. And this promise of wealth, these opportunities on the rivers, it was like a magnet. It fueled more expansion.
Leading to settlements, not just raiding.
Exactly. It incentivized people from Viking societies to actually settle along these rivers. They set up fortified towns, trading posts, places like Ladoga, Novgorod, eventually Kiev.
So they put down roots, built infrastructure.
Yeah, they weren't just passing through anymore. They were becoming part of the landscape merchants, rulers, protectors of these lucrative routes.
But you mentioned a dual nature. It wasn't all peaceful trade, was it?
No, definitely not. While cooperative trade certainly happened in established markets, we absolutely cannot ignore that a huge chunk of the wealth came from pillaging, plundering, capturing people.
So the image of raiders lurking on the river.
It's not just fiction. Historical sources, archaeology, they back it up. Bands of Norse warriors attacking vulnerable Slavic villages, taking riches, taking people for the slave trade. That was a grim reality.
So they could switch roles. Trader one day, raider the next.
Absolutely. Shrewd traders, merciless raiders. It depended on the opportunity, the power dynamics, who they thought they could overpower. They operated across a whole spectrum of interaction.
Okay, so you have this incredibly complex dynamic. Trading partners sometimes, enemies other times. A really volatile beginning.
Very much so.
And all this interaction, the trade, the conflict, the settlement, eventually led to something massive. The foundation of the Kievan Rus.
This is the pivotal moment, yeah. Something that profoundly shaped Eastern Europe's history, with echoes right down to today. And the Kievan Rus, you have to understand, wasn't like a simple kingdom. It was sprawling, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, a real melting pot.
And its origin story is still fought over.
Oh, hugely. It's one of the most contested foundation myths in European history, honestly. The debate is intense.
Let's get into that. The main theory, or one of them, is the Normanist theory, right? What does that say?
Right. The Normanist view, historically pushed more by Western scholars, argues that Scandinavian strongmen Norsemen were the primary founders of the state.
And the key source for that is?
The primary chronicle. That old East Slavic document compiled by monks, probably in Kiev around the early 12th century.
And what does it claim?
It tells this very dramatic story, that in 862 CE, various Slavic and Finnic tribes were fighting amongst themselves, couldn't establish order, so they supposedly invited a Viking chieftain, Rurik, and his brothers to come rule them.
Invited them? Seriously?
That's the claim, to bring stability and law. Rurik supposedly set up shop first in Novgorod in the north. His successors, like Oleg and Igor, then expanded south, took Kiev, and built this huge state covering modern Belarus, Russia, Ukraine.
And the evidence they point to?
Well, the chronicle itself, obviously. Plus, many early rulers of the Rus have clear Norse names. Oleg, Igor, Olga, Vladimir sounds Germanic. And archaeology shows Scandinavian weapons, burial styles, and early Rus sites.
Okay, that sounds pretty compelling. But you said it's fiercely debated. So what's the counterargument? The anti-Normanist theory?
The anti-Normanist theory pushes back hard, often championed by Russian and Soviet historians historically, but it has wider traction, too. They argue the Slavs organized themselves.
That the state formation was internal?
Exactly. That the influence of Scandinavians was minimal, peripheral, maybe some mercenaries, some traders, but not founders or rulers. They say the Kievan Rus was fundamentally a Slavic creation.
And their reasoning?
They stress the huge Slavic majority population, the continuity of Slavic culture and language. They argue the primary chronicle might be, well, later propaganda, a story crafted to legitimize a ruling dynasty by linking them to prestigious foreigners, not necessarily a factual blow-by-blow account.
Okay, so two really strong opposing views. Vikings founded it, or Slavs founded it with minimal outside help. Is there a middle ground, a less politically charged view today?
Yes, thankfully. Most scholars today lean towards a more balanced middle ground approach, less partisan. This view acknowledges, look, both Slavic and Scandinavian elements were really important in shaping the Kievan Rus. You can't deny the Norse presence and impact, especially in the early ruling class, the military elite, the Drushina.
The wargs, the tribute collectors.
Exactly. But this view also stresses that the vast majority of the people, the culture, the eventual character of the state was overwhelmingly Slavic.
So the Norse elite eventually assimilated.
Pretty much. Over time, this Rus's elite adopted Slavic names, language, customs. By the 10th century, Kievan Rus was definitely a powerful, predominantly Slavic state, but you could still see those Norse roots, especially at the top in early laws, maybe some place names. It became this huge hybrid entity, one of the biggest powers in medieval Europe.
And understanding this shared, sometimes contested origin, it's crucial for understanding the region today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, their roots are tangled up in this.
Absolutely crucial. The foundation of these modern nations, their early identity, it goes right back here. It makes it vital history, not just for academics, but for understanding present-day identities, relationships, even conflicts.
Okay, let's connect this back to the bigger picture, beyond just the risk. That Arabic silver you mentioned,
Yeah.
the sheer amount found in Viking hoards. It tells an incredible story about global connections, doesn't it? About where Eastern Europe led them.
Oh, absolutely. This is maybe the most powerful, undeniable evidence we have for just how vast the Viking economy was, how plugged in they were to global networks. Archaeologists dig up these hoards, collections of buried treasure across Scandinavia, Russia, the Baltic, and they find tens of thousands of Arabic silver coins, dirhams.
Tens of thousands.
Yes. And what's really striking is how much these coins outnumber Western European coins in the same finds. It wasn't just pocket change. This Arabic silver was, you could argue, the actual backbone of the Viking Age economy.
Their main source of wealth.
Their main source of bullion, yeah. The currency that paid warriors, funded trade expeditions, drove their whole commercial engine.
Where did all this silver actually come from? Which parts of the Islamic world?
All over the Caliphate, really. Mints in North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, even Central Asia. We find coins from Samanid mints in places like modern Uzbekistan, Abbasid mints in Iraq, Buyid mints in Persia.
Wow, so the reach was enormous.
Huge. And the fact that so much of it ended up in Viking lands, especially via Russia and Ukraine, it just shouts robust, long-distance trade routes, strong connections deep into the east. It shows the Caliphate's economic reach was massive, and the Vikings, or the Rus, were a vital northern link in that chain, pulling that wealth northwards.
And how did they use it? Just as whole coins, or?
This is where it gets really interesting and shows their sophistication. They often didn't use them as whole coins. They chopped them up.
Chop them up.
Yeah, into smaller pieces. Hack silver, it's sometimes called. Then they'd weigh these pieces meticulously to get the exact value needed for a transaction.
Using scales.
Exactly. Archaeologists find these little portable scales in hoards, too. It shows they were part of this sophisticated international bullion economy. Value by weight and purity, not just face value. They totally understood and participated in that system. Really adaptable, commercially savvy.
Okay, silver is compelling. What else does archaeology whisper about connections even further east? Beyond Byzantium, beyond the Caliphates, any hints of, say, China or India?
There are definitely other tantalizing hints. Yeah, some concrete evidence, too. For instance, silk fragments.
Silk in Viking burials.
Yes, in really prestigious burials, like the Oseberg ship in Norway or at Birka in Sweden. An analysis shows this silk wasn't European. The weave patterns, the dyes. They point to China or Central Asia. It traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road.
Wow. So having silk was a huge status symbol.
Immense status. It spoke of incredible wealth and connections. Its presence in these key graves tells you how valued it was and that the networks to get it existed.
What else points that far east?
Glass beads are another one, sometimes really intricate designs, vibrant colors. Chemical analysis traces some of them to India, maybe even China. These weren't simple local crafts.
Complex manufacturing from far away.
Exactly. And then you get traces of other things, certain spices, maybe cloves or cinnamon, specific types of amber, rare woods, even animal remains that can only have come from regions way beyond their usual sphere. It really paints a picture of a global marketplace, even back then.
But the key question, I guess, could these items have just passed through many hands? Did the Vikings get them from Arab traders, who got them from Persians, who got them from, did they personally go that far?
That's the million dirham question, isn't it? And yes, it's absolutely possible, even likely, that many items changed hands multiple times through complex networks. Historians constantly debate the specifics, but the sheer consistency and relative volume of these finds in Viking context suggests more than just random chance. It indicates, at the very least, a strong, reliable connection, direct or indirect, to the furthest reaches of Eurasia.
So they knew about these goods, they valued them, and they had ways to get them, even if they weren't sailing to China themselves.
Precisely. It shows they were plugged into this vast economic web. They knew what was out there, they wanted it, and they were part of the system that moved it around. A truly globalized Viking trade network.
Which brings us to the written word. Beyond the archaeology, do we have stories? Accounts of Vikings actually making these epic journeys deep into Asia.
The texts are fascinating, but often frustratingly ambiguous. The absolute star witness is Ahmad ibn Fadlan.
The 10th century Arab diplomat.
That's him. He traveled from Baghdad on a mission to the Volga Bulgars, and he wrote this incredible account, his Risala, and on the Volga River he met the Rus' Vikings.
And wrote about them.
In amazing detail, provides priceless Viking facts. Their appearance, tall as palm trees, often tattooed, their customs, their trade goods, even their ship burials, including some really grim details about sacrifices. He admired their merchant skills, but famously wasn't impressed with their hygiene.
Right, the shared washing basin story.
That's the one. It's a unique first-hand snapshot of them operating deep in Eastern Europe.
Okay, so he saw them on the Volga. Invaluable. But did he say they were going further east from there? Did he mention China, India?
And that's the crucial limitation. No. His account is incredibly detailed about their activities on the Middle Volga, trading with locals like the Bulgars and Khazars. But he doesn't record them traveling further east themselves. He describes them bringing goods to the Volga market.
Okay, so no direct textual proof from him of journeys beyond that. What about other sources? Sagas? Anything hinting at longer trips?
Well, there are some vaguer hints in later sources. Norse sagas sometimes mention Circland,
Which means?
literally land of the Saracens, generally meaning the Islamic world. Now, in some contexts, people debate if Circland could occasionally imply places even beyond the Caliphate, maybe towards India or Central Asia.
But these sagas are reliable?
Not really, not for this kind of specific geography. They were written down centuries later based on oral tradition, full of poetry and exaggeration. It's really hard to treat them as accurate maps or travelogues for journeys that far east.
So the challenge is separating direct Viking travel from trade through intermediaries.
Exactly, that's the core difficulty. We know they were deeply involved in the trade networks stretching across Asia, but were they the ones doing the final leg of the journey, or were they masterfully leveraging the existing Silk Road networks through middlemen? That's the big, fascinating question.
So boiling it down, did Vikings actually sail to China? It's an amazing image, right? Blockbuster movie stuff.
Yeah.
But the evidence seems to lean towards a different, maybe more complex reality.
Precisely. The idea of direct voyages all the way to China or India remains unproven. There's no solid historical or archaeological smoking gun for that. But what is proven, beyond doubt, is their access to Asian goods and that flood of Arabic silver. And this confirms they successfully tapped into the ancient Silk Road system, largely through middlemen, through interacting with the established trade networks and the peoples who already operated along them.
The intermediaries. Who were they? Who are these vital links connecting the Norse world to the Far East?
It was a diverse mix of peoples, a real tapestry of trade. You had groups like the Khazars.
The powerful empire in southern Russia, Ukraine?
Yeah, controlling key parts of the Volga route. A major power. Then you had the Volga Bulgars, Turkic people who adopted Islam, based in cities like Bulgar on the Volga, a key northern hub for Islamic trade. And beyond them, various other Turkic and Slavic tribes across Central Asia. They all acted as conduits, as bridges, linking the Norse traders coming down the rivers to the routes stretching towards China. They knew the routes, the languages, the politics.
So it was a kind of ecosystem of trade, each group playing a role. What were the Vikings bringing, and what were they getting in return from these middlemen?
The Vikings primarily brought those northern resources, high-value furs, as we said, sable, ermine, beaver, desperately wanted in the Caliphates in Byzantium, and grimly enslaved people. These were their main exports south.
And in return?
The middlemen provided the sought-after goods from further east and south, the silks, the beads, the spices, and crucially, that Arabic silver. It was a sophisticated exchange system, supply and demand across continents, facilitated by these intermediary cultures.
Sounds incredibly pragmatic. Why make the impossibly long, dangerous journey yourself if someone else can bring the goods part way?
That's exactly the insight. It shows the sophistication and the pragmatism of Viking commerce. They understood logistics, risk, profit. Why sail to China if you can meet traders on the Volga who have connections that bring Chinese goods to you, often at a substantial profit for everyone involved? Their genius was leveraging the existing network.
Global entrepreneurs, almost.
You could say that. They focused on acquiring wealth efficiently. This middleman system let them achieve global economic reach without necessarily making the absolute longest physical journeys themselves.
It really does change the image, doesn't it? Not just raiders, not just explorers, but key players in a truly ancient global economy, operating with incredible commercial savvy.
It absolutely transforms the picture. They become integral parts of this vast, interconnected Eurasian system, a real paradigm shift in how we should view them.
Okay, so as the Viking Age itself, let's say roughly, starts winding down, these two peoples, the Norse and the Slavs, they begin to go down different paths, don't they? But not before a major spiritual change hits both of them.
That's right. And interestingly, in their earliest interactions, there was actually some common ground religiously. Both groups were broadly polytheistic.
We mentioned Perun and Mokosh for the Slavs.
Right. And the Norse had Odin, Thor, Freyja, gods tied to nature, fertility, war. These parallels might have actually helped early on, fostered some level of cultural understanding or integration, a shared pagan worldview, in a sense.
But then came Christianity.
Exactly. In the later Viking Age, late 9th through 11th centuries, Christianity really takes hold, spreading both across Scandinavia and deep into Eastern Europe, into the Rus lands.
And how did Christianization happen for the Rus? Was it influenced by Scandinavia?
There was some early influence from the north, maybe some German missionaries too. But the decisive influence came from the south, from the Byzantine Empire, from Constantinople. This whole process really culminated in 988 CE. That's the traditional date when the ruler of Kievan Rus, Vladimir the Great, famously chose Eastern Orthodoxy, got baptized, and basically ordered his whole realm to convert, a massive turning point.
And crucially, choosing Eastern Orthodoxy, not the Western Roman version that was spreading in Scandinavia, set them on a different path.
Absolutely vital distinction. Scandinavia largely became Catholic, linked to Rome and the Latin West. But the Rus looked to Constantinople, adopting Eastern Orthodoxy. This led to a distinctly Slavic Christian tradition. They used Old Church Slavonic in their liturgy, developed their own art styles, their own religious culture. Interestingly, it often blended with older pagan beliefs too, a kind of syncretism.
So this marked a decline in Norse influence.
A major decline, yeah. The Rus elite now looked to Byzantium for cultural and spiritual guidance, not Scandinavia. They forged their own path, culturally and religiously distinct.
It's fascinating how adopting the same broad religion, Christianity, could actually lead to divergence, but still leave this deep mark on both societies.
It really is. You see this relationship evolve, don't you, from profit and plunder?
Right, the early raids and trade.
To governance, settlement, the formation of the Kievan Rus. Then you have the shared pagan background, followed by these parallel yet diverging paths of Christianization. It's a complex tapestry.
And the legacy of all this, it's not just buried history, is it?
Not at all. The Viking, or Rus, legacy in opening up Eastern Europe to trade, establishing those river routes as commercial arteries that lasted for centuries. And their contribution to founding the Kievan Rus, that state became a powerhouse, shaping the whole future of the region.
And connecting directly to modern nations.
Absolutely. Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, all three trace their foundational history, their cultural origins, back to the Kievan Rus period. This era when Slavs and Norse interacted, coexisted, merged. And as the source material we looked at points out, understanding this shared ancestry, these deep historical ties, makes the current conflict in Ukraine feel even more tragic, seen through that historical lens.
It really underlines how interconnected history is, linking people across centuries right up to today.
It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe the thought to leave you with is this. The Viking Age wasn't just about raids in the West. It was maybe even more profoundly about this era of incredible global exchange. It shows how these early societies, the Vikings, the Slavs, could weave this amazing tapestry of connections across huge distances.
Right.
So what does that tell us about globalization? Maybe it's not just a modern thing, you know. Maybe it's this recurring human impulse to connect, to trade, to explore, to push beyond the horizon, a fundamental part of who we are.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other hidden connections, what other vast ancient networks are still out there in history, waiting for us to fully appreciate them? Perhaps you'll find yourself doing your own deep dive now, realizing just how connected our world is.